Hello, everybody, and TGIF. Welcome back to Fossil Friday Chats. I'm Brittany from the Western Science Center. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Gabe Santos from the Alf Museum.
What's up, everybody?
And today we are joined by yet another staff member from the Alf Museum today, Jared Heuck. How you doing, Jared?
Oh, pretty good. Thanks for having me on. Longtime fan.
I'm really excited to find out.
Caller.
I'm really excited to find all about how to make rocks a part of your life today.
Every day.
Every single day.
Oh, yeah. So, Jared is the preparator at the Alf Museum. He graduated from Montana State University and was active at the Museum of the Rockies during his time there. He received his master's degree from California State University-Fullerton. Go Titans. As the preparator of the Malcom McKenna Fossil Preparation Lab, Jared is responsible for managing preparation projects and for the preparation, repair, and conservation of the museum's fossil specimens. He also assists in teaching the museum after-school program. So, yeah, rocks are kind of your entire life.
Yep, every day. Can't get away from them.
I just realized we're all Titans. That's so cool. I didn't put that together.
I'm official now.
Yeah, you are. All official Titan Masters.
If you guys have any questions for Jared, as always, go ahead and put those in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session after his presentation. And today we're going to learn all about whales, snails, and some other cool paleontology things from Jared, right?
That's right.
Awesome. Well, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Let me share my screen. How about that? All right. So as Brittany said, my name is Jared, and I went to school at Montana State. One of my favorite things to do in this paleontology program was do a lot of field work. So I've had a lot of experience in Egg Mountain, Hell Creek, all like the really cool classic paleo places. And then I moved back to California to pursue my master's degree, which fieldwork in California looks very different than fieldwork in Montana. So here's a good example. This was actually my field site for my master's thesis. So today I'm going to talk about whales, snails, and rodents and how they all connect together. You can see this guy on the right is some of the whales that I'm going to be talking about today. So first, just a little outline of what we're going to be doing. I'm going to go through some of the background of this project. I'm going to talk about the rodents that we find in this area, talk about some snails, and then finally go over some of these conclusions. So what are cetaceans? Cetaceans are whales. We can divide them into two groups. The first is mysticetes, or baleen-bearing whales. These are the ones that we know of are very large filter-feeding creatures. And the second group of cetaceans are odontocetes. These are toothed whales, and yes, they include dolphins. All dolphins are whales, but not all whales are dolphins. So here's a simplified family tree of cetaceans. The split between toothed whales and baleen whales occurred about 40 million years ago, right there. But here we can see all of our toothed whales. Here are all of our filter feeding or our baleen whales, but we're only going to focus on these guys. So let's zoom in on this one. Right here are our large open water filter feeding whales that we're all familiar with. But there's this second weirder group of baleen whales. And these are the mammalodontids and the adiocetids. These are more raptorial. They are actually toothed, so they are toothed baleen whales. So here's some of their really weird teeth, funky looking skulls. These toothed mysticetes are found all around the Pacific margin. They are clearly toothed based on their fossils. There is some debate over whether or not they also had baleen, some sort of weird filter feeding, toothy hunting strategy. But most important for this is they went extinct by the Oligocene 23 million years ago. So that red line, you can see all of our toothed mysticetes disappear. We do not find them in rocks younger than 23 million years old. So let's go to Laguna Canyon. This is a site in Orange County, Southern California, and it was the location of some mitigation from 2003 to 2006. In California, whenever you're doing construction in these fossiliferous rocks, you have paleontologists coming out, they'll dig up all the fossils, and it usually results in a rather large collection and a really useful and informative mitigation report. So here's a geologic map of the area. There are two formations here. One is the light pink, and that's kind of in the northern end of the area, and that's the Vaqueros Formation. And the second is this darker pink called the Sespe. You'll notice, again, Vaqueros is kind of on top and Sespe's a little bit below it. And my field site was this orange strip. This was once a road that was expanded outwards. So when they expanded, they had to dig through all of these formations. Here's a grander map of Orange County with the Sespe and Vaqueros formations. The Vaqueros is fossiliferous, and it represents a stage of rising sea levels in Southern California. Because of that, all of the fossils in this area are going to be marine. And its age ranges from Oligocene to early Miocene. There's quite a big range there. And it's typically found above the Sespe, kind of like in our geologic cross-section here. We also have the Sespe Formation, and this is similar to Vaqueros. It's got a wide age range, late Eocene to early Miocene. You'll notice that they do overlap, but the key difference is that it's terrestrial, still fossiliferous, but it was deposited on land. And again, it's usually older than the Vaqueros, but there's always exceptions. And if you look at this map closely, you may notice that there is a third color here. That is the Sespe Vaqueros undifferentiated. So it's usually really interbedded. You have like tons of Sespe here and tons of Vaqueros. They're just kind of mixed in together. And it's not really fossiliferous. That makes it very hard to determine what formation it actually is. So geologists saw this and they were just like, done a Sespe Vaqueros undifferentiated. And it's been that way for a while. Our locality is highly fossiliferous. We have all sorts of things. There are rodent teeth like this little guy, which is less than 1 millimeter long. We have tons of invertebrates, some really cool snails, and a lot of really cool and unique marine invertebrates. So here you can see the mitigation companies towing along some of these fossils. This locality is a little tricky when we're trying to figure out how old it is, though. For one, it's highly faulted. You can see all of these dashed lines are fault, where there's been some sort of displacement of the rocks. It makes it really hard to correlate from one area to another within this spot. So even if you knew the age of one specific area, it could be that 50 feet away, it's a different age. We also don't have any absolute ages. That is an age that is a specific number, not necessarily a range. You would think of this as like carbon dating. In our case, we would use strontium, which I tried, and the numbers just weren't reliable. So no absolute ages. Despite this, we did get an estimated age range of this locality of Vaqueros as early Miocene. This is based on all of these fossils, our rats, our snails, and our marine mammals. So let's go back to our whales. Here's our toothed mysticetes with our red line marking the extinction of all of them. The only drawback with this Laguna Canyon locality and its Miocene age is that we do find these toothed mysticetes. And remember, they went extinct 23 million years ago. So if the proposed age for the Vaqueros is 18.6 to 16 million years old, that means we have some really young toothed mysticetes. This age has been spread in the literature over a number of years. The only problem is that it's not really a peer-reviewed paper. This is a mitigation report, and no one's really taken a lot of time to really dig in to the details. Here's an example of a figure that's presented in some of these papers, where again, here's our little Orange County paleontological collection toothed mysticetes, way out here in the Miocene. So my project, as my master's thesis, was to describe and identify these teeth, specifically the rodent teeth, look at these Vaqueros invertebrates and figure out if they can tell us anything about the age of this locality. And last, how this age might influence the patterns of our toothed mysticetes across this 23 million year old boundary. All right, so let's dive into rats. We're going to be talking about North American land mammal assemblages or ages, NALMAs for short. We're talking about two, specifically the Arikarian and Hemingfordian. These NALMAs are based on first appearances and extinctions of different land mammals. So for example, the beginning of the Arikarian, AR1 on the bottom left of the screen, is marked by the first appearance of Plesiosminthus, this tiny little rat. Later on in the Miocene, you have the appearance of certain types of Oreodonts, as well as other rodents. So we can use the appearances or sometimes even the lack of these fossils to figure out our age. Now, our Sespe fossils in the Laguna Canyon locality are pretty plentiful. We have a lot of tooth enamel fragments. Most of them are camels or Oreodonts. Very hard to figure out the precise age. What's useful are the rats, these cute little rodents. So what do these specimens look like? Lots of chunks of teeth. All of these were identified down to the species level, though. You can see even down here, this Trogomys rupidiminthe is just a fragment of a molar. This individual piece is probably 1/4 of a millimeter across. Now keep in mind, these rodent teeth are what were used to determine the age, which is circled down in the bottom in red. I looked at these teeth for a while and decided that there really wasn't enough distinctive features. I'm not about to say that these tooth mysticetes survived this extinction event based on fragments of teeth. Okay, so how many of these teeth are both identifiable and useful for age determinations? What I figured out was the most useful specimens have to be mostly complete. We need to preserve those certain diagnostic features, and they can't be wide-ranging. You want to determine if something is Miocene or Oligocene. You can't have a rat that spans that boundary. It's not going to be very useful. Out of over 700 teeth, 11 fit these parameters, 1.5%. So I'm going to look at a couple of these teeth. The first is this cute little guy. The range of Trogomys is outlined here in red. And so I thought to myself, how do we know that this is really what these paleontologists identified it as? So I went back to the literature. Here's the holotype skull of Trogomys rupidiminthe. Here's the lower teeth on the right-hand side. There's our P4, which is what this was identified as. You'll notice they don't really look the same. So what does the description say? First of all, we have 4 cusps or chewing nubs. There they are, 1, 2, 3, 4. The lophids are subparallel, which just means that they're kind of crooked. There are really no wear patterns on this tooth, so that wasn't useful. And the paper also described these teeth as, quote, highly variable. Very useful. With only one little premolar available to Trogomys rupidiminthe, I could not say confidently that this is how the tooth was identified. Okay, well, that's 1 out of 11. We'll scratch that one. Let's check something else. Again, we go back to the holotype. We look at the description of this tooth. The range of heteromies is really young. It actually is much younger than the age of the Vaqueros that was given in this paper, but we'll overlook that for now. It was, again, 4 little cusps. It was crooked. The protolophid was narrower than the metalophid, which is pretty typical for a lot of these teeth. Didn't really have too many wear patterns. It also had this weird cusp right here connecting our two, our protolophid and metalophid. This is not mentioned in the description of this tooth. So you might notice that that's a very similar description. These teeth don't necessarily look the same, but they're described in the same way. So myoheteromes, not sure if that's what this is. But a lot of these teeth had these very similar properties. 4 cusps, they were all small, they had little to no wear. They all had that crooked protolophid and metalophid. They did have some unique features though, like this OCPC 1727 was a little more offset than the other ones. This myoheteromes had this little transverse ridge. This Malcomes altifluminus had this anterior lophid kind of sticking out that none of the other teeth really had. But they weren't necessarily unique enough to identify any of this down to a species level. We didn't have a large enough sample size. So what can we say about our rats? Super small sample size. The features are variable, but not distinctive enough. And because of this, I removed all of the identifications from a species level down to a family level. As you can imagine, this family level is very wide-ranging. So here's the age proposed in this document. And here's the updated range. Not useful. Okay, so the rats were not very helpful. What about the snails? All of our snails came from the Vaqueros Formation. Specifically, these 2 localities, these gray boxes. An example of a little clam. Based on the mollusks, these invertebrates, they said that the age of the Vaqueros was 18.5 to 16, or even younger. This age is reinforced by some magnetic stratigraphy studies, which we'll talk about later. But the main tool that was used in this are California provincial molluscan stages. These were created over 100 years ago. And it's basically a method of looking at what invertebrates we have available to us and seeing what sort of time period that they lived in. Okay, so huge chart incoming. These specific details are not super important, but you'll notice that different areas of California might have different ages. For instance, all of this is divided. You have the San Joaquin Hills to the far right, where my locality is. In the middle, you have the eastern Santa Monica Mountains. You have the Simi Valley all the way to the left of this chart. And all of these formation ages are different. The reason is because as sea levels changed, California was really a series of independent basins. So your water level might rise over here, but stay the same over here. So you have deposition, but none on this basin. As sea levels lowered, you would have a similar trend. So for instance, the Sespe in Oak Ridge is about 20 million years older than the Sespe in the Puente Hills. And for the Vaqueros, so all these oranges are Vaqueros. We have some in the central Santa Monicas, some in the Santa Ana Mountains. Underneath that one, there's just a bunch of question marks. No one knows how old it is. The one in Oak Ridge and Simi Valley, I need a magnifying glass to figure out what's going on in there, but it's super complex geologically. The Vaqueros that I was interested in is over here on the right-hand side, and it does cross that Oligocene-Miocene boundary. So these California provincial molluscan stages are, again, not offering a clear answer. But I'm not the only one that's had this trouble. There's been papers written ever since 1935 talking about the Vaqueros Formation. So here's my favorite. What is the Vaqueros Formation, and is it Oligocene? We are still asking that question today. The mitigation report for this construction described a very distinct invertebrate fauna that provides a well-defined early Miocene age. What invertebrates were they looking at? They had 4 distinct taxa: Turritella inazana and Rapana vaquerosensis. Both of these fit within this vaqueros molluscan stage. I put that in quotes because the vaqueros formation and the vaqueros molluscan stage are different, thus lending to a lot of extra confusion. The other 2 taxa are these turret snails, Tembulorensis and Okoyana. They are in the Temblor stage, which is also a formation, not to be confused. Yet, the age of the formation given in this mitigation report is all the way over here in the Temblor stage. They seemingly just kind of ignored our other snails. They said, well, I like this age, and we're not going to talk about these other snails. You might have noticed between the vaqueros and Temblor stages is the transition stage. This is basically kind of like our Sesame vaqueros undifferentiated. It's just weird occurrences of these invertebrates, and people went, there's something in between these 2 stages, and it's not well defined. Turns out 3 of our 4 taxa are within that transition stage. But this transition stage, you might notice way down here, here's our Oligocene-Miocene extinction event. The transition stage is within the Miocene. So the question is, are these taxa conclusive enough to show that our toothed mysticetes survived this extinction? Because they were found alongside these snails. Well, if you dig a little deeper into the literature, what you find are very strange occurrences. Sometimes you find these vaqueros stage invertebrates stratigraphically above Temblor stage invertebrates. Sometimes your transition molluscan stage has foraminifera that are oligocene. Very strange, but we can essentially extend these ranges out. The dotted lines represent a sort of weird occurrences. To summarize, our invertebrate taxa span all of these stages, from the vaqueros, which is Oligocene, to the Temblor stage, which is Miocene. But there's 1 or 2 more key things here. Our Oligocene taxa, this Turritella inazana and Rapana vaquerosensis, are very widespread. They're found all through that entire section of the vaqueros. Our Miocene taxa, these Turritella okoyana and Tembulorensis, are restricted to a single horizon, just 1 small spot in this entire span of vaqueros where they were found. Unfortunately, there is a lot of missing locality data. We are not able to pinpoint where a lot of these specimens were found. That makes me very sad. But the plus side is there has never been a single locality describing all 3 of these turret snails together. Question is, do these invertebrates represent the early Miocene transition stage or the vaqueros, which is Oligocene and very earliest Miocene? We have 2 interpretations. The first is that the vaqueros at Laguna Canyon spans a portion of the transition stage into the Miocene. All of our gastropods, our invertebrates, are in their appropriate stages, and we have Miocene toothed mysticetes. That's pretty cool. The second interpretation is that the vaqueros at Laguna Canyon spans the vaqueros stage. That means that the ages of these snails are not very well constrained, and that our toothed mysticetes are still in the Oligocene, but possibly in the earliest Miocene. There's just this little chunk right here. For this research, I settled on interpretation 2, that the vaqueros at Laguna Canyon is equivalent to the vaqueros molluscan stage. This is based on multiple things, 2 big ones. The first is that we really don't have these toothed mysticetes in Miocene strata. So if you find them, it's probably a safe assumption that you're in the Oligocene. The second is that it is very well documented that these invertebrates have very unorthodox occurrences, and they're not very well constrained. For example, the Channel Islands, they're just kind of a mess all in there. because of California's weird tectonics and our independent basins, it makes it very hard to determine the accurate ages. So there's one more thing we can look at. If this is the proposed age for the vaqueros, from this mitigation report, is there any similarly aged strata or fauna in Southern California? We can just compare the two. Do they look the same? Do they look different? Turns out there is. This is Sharktooth Hill bone bed. And that's the age. This is a very reliable age. It has those absolute dates from strontium dating, magnetic dates, land mammal assemblages, diatoms, foraminifera. It's pretty well constrained, and it's right there in the middle of our vaqueros. So do these have similar fauna? Here's all of our cetaceans, baleen whales, toothed whales, and everything in between. Here's the proposed age, that Miocene age of the vaqueros. And here's Sharktooth Hill. The vaqueros has all of these families, lots of cool dolphins, our toothed mysticete whales, and those lineages are outlined in pink. Sharktooth Hill bone bed has these, our large baleen whales, our large toothed mysticetes like sperm whales. They also have things like odontocetes, odobenidae. So these are like seals and things. I believe, Gabe, your brother drew this illustration. And they also have things like porpoises. None of these colors overlap. There are no porpoises. There are no seals in the vaqueros at Laguna Canyon. There is zero overlap between these two similarly aged localities. So what does this mean for the overall distribution of cetaceans, of our toothed mysticetes? Well, this locality is really important because here I have it circled. It kind of spans this weird dead zone between Baja California Sur to the south and the Pacific Northwest to the north of us. To the left, I have outlined in red all of the occurrences of toothed mysticetes. And here's our proposed age of Laguna Canyon, which, based on our interpretation of these invertebrates, should be much older, way down here. This leaves a possible gap. Could we have Miocene toothed mysticetes? That molluscan stage spans a million years after the Oligocene-Miocene boundary. We can't really narrow it down if this locality is only Oligocene, so it leaves open that possibility. So let's take a look at distributions of a lot of these whales over time. This chart that I'm going to pull up is all of our cetaceans in vertebrate fossil assemblages. So way up here, this is very young into the Miocene. We have 299 occurrences of cetaceans, toothed, baleen, doesn't matter, just whales, out of almost 6,000 vertebrate specimens. How does this change over time as we get closer to that extinction event? As we get a little older, pretty good, 4.5% of our fossils are whales out of 8,000, plenty of vertebrate localities. But once we get down to this early Miocene, we really don't have a lot of vertebrate fossil assemblages. It just kind of stops. The proportion hasn't changed too much. We just have a lot less of them. And then immediately when you get back into the late Oligocene, those numbers shoot back up. This has been what's called the fossil dark age. Did not create it, but I like that name a lot. In the Oligocene, we have our toothed mysticetes. There's tons of different body types, sizes, feeding strategies, and then they go through this dead zone, this dark age. We don't really know what was happening, but when they come out of it, they become large pelagic bulk filter feeders. They lose their teeth because presumably they went extinct. So what's going on in there? In fact, in this dark age, we only have 4 vertebrate fossils, or sorry, excuse me, 4 cetacean fossils. There is some precedent for having whales, tooth mysticetes, survive this extinction, and that is the eomysticetes. These are early diverging, filter-feeding mysticetes. They had actually really small vestigial teeth. They were thought to go extinct by the end of the Oligocene. However, in New Zealand, one was described, and it was confidently early Miocene. So again, if we look at our chart here, here's that little guy in yellow, and here's our adiacete at the top. It could be possible that they did survive into the Miocene, but I'm unconvinced. So let's wrap this up. The proposed age of the Vaqueros at Laguna Canyon, early Miocene, was supported by a few things. These sespe rodents, these terrestrial rodents, were described as early Miocene. We had invertebrates that were early Miocene, and we had magnetic stratigraphy that was supposed to be early Miocene. This led to the conclusion that these toothed mysticetes survived into the early Miocene. But I plan to change that. These Miocene sespe rodents were inconclusive. You could not narrow them down enough to figure out what age they were. These invertebrate ranges are very malleable, very unorthodox occurrences. The magnetic stratigraphy was incomplete, not enough data, and a lot of this magnetic stratigraphy was based on the occurrences of these same rodents and invertebrates. So if you're basing it off of something that is inconclusive, your end result is also inconclusive. The fourth reason that I've decided to keep the Vaqueros at Laguna Canyon within the Oligocene or earliest Miocene, the Vaqueros molluscan stage, is because all vertebrates in the Vaqueros at Laguna Canyon appear in the late Oligocene. There's no crossover. We also have a dugong from the Vaqueros, which is a very cool little specimen, which suggests something even as old as the Eocene, but definitely not Miocene. This does lead us to have more questions than answers, though. What happened to our toothed mysticetes during this fossil dark age? Could they have survived into the earliest Miocene, like eomysticetids? We don't have enough data to show that this locality is strictly Oligocene. There's always that little shred of hope. So lastly, here's a good panorama of the locality. And I will be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you for listening.
And we're back.
All right. All right. Thank you, Jared. It's really cool to see that you can use both something really, really big and something really, really small to kind of help you in your quest to determine the age of this formation.
Way too small. Those teeth were like 7 millimeter. It was.
Yeah.
Actually,
yeah.
I took those photos at the Raymond Alf Museum before I worked there full time. So
Aww.
shout out to the Alf.
Woo. What is it like trying to? Oh, go ahead, Britt.
Same question.
Oh, okay.
I think Gabe had. We had both the same question: is how do you analyze something so tiny?
Really good tech support. You basically need a fancy camera and a cool device that'll basically take slices of photos. So you set it to go down a fraction of a millimeter at a time and then take a photo. That way you get slices of the tooth that are all in focus. And then you take those slices and smush them all together and get one that was in focus. Gabe was actually the one to set that up for me. And it's still working to this day.
It's really cool, like, the technology. It's not even, like, new technology. It's just, like, things that we have to be able to analyze, like, fossils, like, taking tiny little photos of tiny little teeth and being able to, like, blow them up in high definition and look at all the detail and be able to share those kinds of things nowadays, from photographs to 3D modeling. It's just so cool being able to see these kinds of things make those connections. See these things to make those connections.
Absolutely. And if you recall the holotype specimen of Tragomys, it was published in, I think, the 1920s. And obviously we had microscopes, and you can look at tiny things through a microscope really, really well and describe it, but we didn't really have the capacity to take those photos. And so a lot of people relied on illustration to do it, which is also very helpful. Do both.
Oh yeah.
Photos and illustrations. Do both. Pay your illustrations.
Speaking of illustrations, shout out to our illustrators in the chat today. We had Rob and Philip out there today. Really quick question for you, Jared. Maybe not quick question. We'll see. For you, while you were working on all these things, from snails to whales to rodents, what was it like in your head when you were trying to find the connections for all of these? Because a lot of people may think about paleontology. I know I talk about a lot, but we tend to kind of compartmentalize things, separate things based on subjects. So people are like, oh, separate snail fossils, invertebrates, whales, and rodents. 3 different things. But for you, you had to make these connections in your brain to kind of come up with an answer. What was that like, trying to connect the dots?
It's funny you think that's a short answer, or a quick question. I'll keep it short, though. Essentially, you definitely had to have that shift in your brain working from one to another. For example, like you said, a lot of people specialize only in one thing. And so the difficulty came when I first looked at these teeth, and I probably spent weeks on weeks trying. I confirmed their identification based on the ID that was given in the report. But I was trying to figure out how old they were, because I didn't want to take that for granted. I was like, no, I need to double check their work. If they say that this is a Miocene rodent, I need to be sure that it's a Miocene rodent. I skipped the step of being sure that it was actually what they identified. And so it was just a deep dive into a lot of rodent literature that mammals are weird, rodents are weird. But then I noticed that when people were saying, oh, these rodents are age X or Y, they were referring to papers where people had been describing other taxa that weren't rodents. And so instead of confirming that work, they just cited it, which, sometimes you have to do. I understand that. But I wanted to really make sure, because you can cite yourself to the point where you have 15 million year old adiocetids. And it's like, that's 8 million years after they went extinct. We should double check this. So going from that rodent mindset of these tiny little teeth and looking at the lophids and learning the vocabulary, and then going to the invertebrate assemblages, which are like all over the place in California. Nothing is well constrained or even very well defined. I had to rely a lot on different experts to confirm what I was thinking. And honestly, I didn't really dive too much into the whale stuff. We won't get into that. That's a can of worms. I took the idea. I was like, yep, that looks like an adiocetid, all right. Let's go from there.
Yeah, you can definitely have a lot of shall we say, rabbit holes in literature if you decide to travel down them. So I can understand why. Yeah, at some point, this was for your master's degree, correct? So at some point, you have to graduate.
Yeah. I wanted to be confident in my work too, but it was definitely a combination of the two.
Let's see. Here's a great question. This is from Bailey. Hi, Bailey. Do you think there's still a lot of work to be done in reevaluating the ages of some formations?
Absolutely. The Sesame Vaqueros and differentiated, like I said, is just a catch-all. You can get down to things like the Topanga, which Gabe is more familiar with than I am. A lot of places in California do not have well-constrained ages. And I can't think of a single paleontologist or geologist in Southern California that would disagree with that. There's a ton of work that needs to be done. I think a lot of the difficulty comes from you're going from construction to mitigation to repository to research. There's a lot of ways that data can go missing. Field techniques may be different from one group to another. It requires a lot of communication. There's just a lot of steps to be involved in there. So yes, plenty of work in all of our Southern California geology.
And for our audience, I'm wondering, what do you think is like the importance of dating all of these formations in Southern California? Like, why go to the trouble of figuring out how old something is?
It really goes into recreating the whole geologic history of the area, of where your different basins are, and sort of remapping this history. You also have moments of little extinction events of these different taxa appearing in different areas. Additionally, across the Oligocene and through most of the Miocene, you have a lot of changes of climate. And so you want to know what areas are being impacted. When are these things going extinct? Is there any sort of correlation between what we're observing with the fossils and what we see with the rocks? It's really hard to get that correlation if you don't have the age.
Awesome. This is another question from Bailey, and I think it's a great question. What's your favorite snail?
Snail.
Neil. Oh, we've stumped him.
Well, I was getting ready for what's your favorite fossil,
Oh.
because Bailey asks that every time.
Mhm.
I think my favorite snail is Turritella templarensis. In fact, I'm gonna pull up a photo of it because I love it so much. But it was one of the most common snails in our locality.
Mhm.
Oh, hold on. Let me cut over.
So it was this guy on the right. If Gabe, if you've pulled that up.
Cute.
So I really like it because it's got all these cool sharp edges. It was really fun to draw. Okeana has all these like really small striations. Inazana on the left has just like tons of little bumps between the whorls.
Hmm.
Honestly, asking me my favorite snail is like asking me my favorite child. I don't have children, but I love my snails.
um, Here's a question from Philip. Shout out to Philip, one of the Alf Museum artists. How do you think researchers should balance the push for new discoveries with revisiting and revising older work that may require reevaluation using modern thinking and techniques? This is
Ooh,
a great question,
Mhm.
Philip.
I have opinions on things. It's important to do both. And there is a lot of work to be done going back and looking at these things with modern techniques. But I think a lot of that difficulty, like I mentioned earlier, is a lot of that data is lost. And that sucks. Or, for instance, my snails, there was one really big Rapana vicarosensis, just a big gastropod. And I was like, this is an Oligocene taxa. Where was it? You have this entire section of Vicaros. If it was found at the top, that might change our interpretation as opposed to if it was found on the bottom. If it was younger, if it was older. No one knew where it came from. So it's like, at a certain point, can you even go back and check that information? The Laguna Canyon locality is paved over. There's plenty of outcrop there, but it's all covered in grasses. So it's like you kind of have to wait and bide your time. But then you're again dealing with that communication of going from construction mitigation repositories and stuff like that. There's a ton of stuff to learn by going back into that old information. And honestly, I don't think there's any one really good way to do it. But in doing so, you can get new information. So for example, the Alf is going up to Wyoming to dig in localities that haven't been touched in 100 years. It's basically new, but it's also revisiting old work. So there's definitely a crossover between the two. And with a lot of new techniques, there has been a lot of work going into that older data. So we have strontium dating, for example. We didn't have that when California provincial molluscan stages were started in 1906, 1920. So plenty of work to be done. I think it's also less exciting when it comes to like spreading that information. People want new things. They want big things. They want cool whales. They don't want little snails or rats. They want something that's going to catch the spotlight. So there's definitely that angle to consider as well.
I think that's important for people to realize and remember, is that a big part of science is reproducibility and being able to go back and retest old ideas, and that's how we develop new ideas, right? Like, if you think about how paleontology has changed in our view of dinosaurs in even the last few years, it's because people have made new discoveries, but have also taken those new discoveries and reevaluated the way we've looked at older discoveries in dinosaurs. It's not just paleontology, but it's important in all science that we are able to reproduce and retest and continue to gather new evidence so that we can get new perspectives on the way we view the world.
And it should be said that a lot of that takes a course of years.
Yeah.
Of someone doing research, publishing it a year or two later, reading it, studying that again for a year or two, and publishing. I mean, these conversations, these debates over these scientific ideas and processes can take decades. And then even then, you have to remember our ultimate goal is to communicate this to the public. How long does it take for that information to disseminate to everyone else is a whole nother beast.
About 45 minutes on Fossil Friday chats.
46.
46 yes. Minutes. It also takes a bunch of funding, so for those of you out there, make sure you support your scientists, your local museum and things like that.
Yeah, this really underscores the importance of collections, especially. This is why museums have these big old warehouse-like areas full of fossils that they keep in perpetuity. You want to have those fossils around for hundreds of years, possibly, so that people in the future can reevaluate them.
Yeah, speaking of which, I'm really excited to see more research that might come out from this locality, because we do have a really cool dugong specimen, and I know someone's been working on that one recently. There's tons of fossils that came out of here and not a lot of research, so there's still plenty to do.
Awesome. Well, it looks like that's all of our questions for Jared. Do you have one more?
There was a question from Rob in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Gabe. Sorry, Rob. What more can we learn from this formation or the specimens you found? Are there other localities you can visit that might answer some of your lingering questions?
Other localities, yes, but they're hard to get to because they're under parking lots. So you kind of just have to wait for construction, unfortunately. I did manage to get out to this field site and look around. Outcrop was very hard to find. The bureaucratic process of actually getting a permit to even walk was mind-numbingly boring and complex. There's a lot of roadblocks in the way for something like this. But if you recall the map of even just Orange County, there's still plenty of sesame and vaqueros localities. But again, that's a conversation that's been going on for 80 years at least. It's just not well known. So I would love to be able to look at other localities. Probably the best way to tackle that sort of thing would be to go back and look at our California molluscan stages and really revisit how we know what we know about them. Go to the Channel Islands, see if our new techniques looking at diatoms and radiolarians and stuff can help narrow down those ages, and then apply them to the vaqueros as opposed to looking at the vaqueros for the answers.
Sweet. All right. Well, I think that does it for questions now.
Sorry, Rob.
Last question, Jared, that we usually ask all of our guests is, what piece of advice would you give for future paleontologists out there who might be interested in getting in the field or looking at the vaqueros or something like that?
I'm trying to think of a good one. Honestly, I think it's just talking to people, making connections, volunteering your time, and listening. If people are offering you advice, you should probably take it. If you trust the person that it's coming from, for sure. I should give that caveat. Don't listen to everyone. Just, but you know, Gabe and Brittany and myself, we've all approached this career in paleontology in different ways. We've all taken different paths, but none of it would have been possible if we didn't just ask people for advice and listen to that advice when it's given to us, even if it's a criticism. Like, just got to listen to it and adapt and move forward and just stay involved, talk to people, be active. I think that's a great way to do it.
Yes. We can all take a little bit of criticism, as much as it hurts sometimes. I'm just kidding. I'm good at taking criticism. No, I'm not. Anyway. Thanks a lot, Jared, for joining us today on the show. Kind of obvious, but if people want to learn more about you and the museum, where can they go?
They can ask Gabe Santos.
There you go.
No, they can go to the Alf Museum page, Instagram. I don't think we're on Twitter anymore. I don't know
we are.
Social media.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So you can
talk now.
Yeah, you can find the Alf Museum on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now we have a TikTok. We recently just did Ask a Curator Day, so there's a lot of really cool stuff on there. And pretty soon, Jared, I'm going to force to be on the TikTok, so you can see Jared on there eventually, too. It's going to happen. You have no choice in the matter.
Just let it happen, Jared. He's going to get his way.
Well, that was my piece of advice, is to listen, so.
Yeah, see? Listen to your own advice. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us on the show today. As always, if you like this program and want to support programs like it at the Alf Museum and the Western Science Center, you can find links on how to do that in the description below. As always, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the world of paleontology. We'll see you all next week. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.